if you're just running a solo practice, unless you've built some key elements within that are transferable, that business is going to fade away when you fade away. And I can tell you most businesses, this is actually, even the successful ones, here's how they start. You work for somebody else, you learn some skills, you get good at it, and then one of two things happen. One, your boss really ticks you off one day and you say, that's it, I'm out of here, I'm going out on my own. Or two, your boss screws up, the business fails, and you go, I'm out on my tuchus. What do I do? Well, I know how to make this or serve this or sell that. I'll do that on my own. And somebody hires you and says, oh, gee, Jerome's really good at making widgets. I need you to make some widgets for me. So you make some widgets. And then that guy tells somebody else, says, hey, you should buy widgets from Jerome. He's phenomenal. Now you have two customers. 2 becomes 20, 20 becomes 40, 40 becomes 80. Next thing you know, you hire employees, you get staff, you're dealing with the Department of Labor and all this other stuff. And then 25 years go by, and now you're running a multi-million-dollar business.
There's a difference between a dream chaser and a dream catcher. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Dream Catchers podcast. I'm your host, Jerome. And I will tell you that this episode is going to be phenomenal because we've got a guy on the show who's got 40 years in the game. He's seen it all. He's exited 3 businesses. He's helped countless others exit their businesses. He's seen the exit paradox up close and personal and actually has been working on that problem for a while. But Paul, so glad to be on with you. It's so cool that somebody that you met a pretty long time ago remembered your name and told me that you're a person that I needed to reach out to. So thank you for making time for us and coming on the show to share your wisdom.
Well, thanks for inviting me on. And as I said, the lesson of, always take time to listen to other people, because you never know when the person you're speaking with, even if there isn't some immediate feedback or connection, will remember if you're memorable.
Being memorable. So we do things a little different here, Paul. If people want to learn more about you, what's the best place for them to go to do that?
LinkedIn. I used to say websites, but now I just say LinkedIn. So it's Paul F. Cronin. So LinkedIn.com and Paul F. Cronin. There's a lot of Paul F. Cronins. I think the only one in the Boston area present. Maybe there's more. But that's a great place to go. I do have a couple of websites to share. One is called theplatinumyears.com. And that really speaks to sort of my philosophy about exiting businesses and how you prepare yourself for the next chapter. And the other is my mergers and acquisition practice, which is called True North Advisors. And that is TNAG, like the initials, True North Advisors Group.org. So anyway, that's how to reach me. But LinkedIn really is where I speak. It's where I, talk about things. So you can kind of, if you click through and you can see various posts, and I usually post a couple of times a month.
Okay. So I like to open up the show with the question. So you had an exit.
I've had a few.
So I think you're the first person that said it in such a concise way. What are the ways that people exit from their business when we think about just ending their relationship with it altogether?
Yeah, I like to say there's essentially 2 ways actually to leave a business. You can plan for it on your terms or let others plan it for you. There's really no door number 3. And if you recognize that and you embrace that, then you can look at, if you will, the technical options, right? So the technical options would be an internal candidate, family team manager, an external candidate, whether it's an individual buyer, a larger competitor, sometimes called a strategic buyer, or today there's an enormous amount of private equity firms, even boutique firms, that buy relatively small companies. They will sometimes buy $5 million companies just as often as they buy $50 million companies. And of course, the third option is dissolution, where you just realize maybe you and your business partner can't get along anymore. I've had that experience. and you say, here's how we split things up. You do your thing, I do my thing, peace, brother, and move on. Uh, Unfortunately, it doesn't always end up that way, where you don't plan well, right? And you end up, if liquidation or bankruptcy, and I've got a million stories, sad stories of people that I've talked to over the years who didn't plan well. But I've got some good stories too.
So what's cool about this is you have taken it to the core, just the simplest level. You, you can plan it or not. If you plan it, you've got these options. If you don't, then you have these options. And so you used the word decision tree in our previous call, and I've only heard that used by industrial engineers. So this is really cool that like you're giving people the map to get to the place. So when I hear you say bankruptcy, that sounds like the exact opposite of what most people think about when they say they're exiting their company.
Yep. And depending whose statistics you believe, and there aren't particularly great statistics, but any given business only has about a 1 in 10 chance of succeeding, right? And so what happens to the other 9 that don't work, right? So they typically liquidate or fade away, and some people call that. Some of them are, and you also have to understand, most businesses in the United States are solo practices. They're non-employee businesses, something like 80 or 90% of them. So it kind of makes sense that if you're just running a solo practice, unless you've built some key elements within that that are transferable, that business is going to fade away when you fade away, how you choose is that. But for that small portion, that has employees and customers and vendors and all that intellectual property, those are the, businesses that everybody else in the mergers and acquisition world really focus on.
And why is that? Why is that their focus? Because it seems like there's some
Well,
pretty cool stuff
the
there.
the individual business, as they say, the solopreneur, or often a practitioner, it could be a business consultant. Um, and it's often hard for an individual business consultant to sort of transfer anything to anybody else because it's really driven by them. You could have a solo attorney. Theoretically, you may have some clients that you could transfer over, and maybe get some financial gain from there. And I don't work in that realm. But there are a lot of businesses, and I can tell you most businesses, this is actually, even the successful ones, here's how they start. You work for somebody else, you learn some skills, you get good at it, and then one or two things happen. One, your boss really ticks you off one day, and you say, that's it, I'm out of here, I'm going out on my own. Or two, your boss screws up, the business fails, and you go, I'm out on my tuchus. What do I do? Well, I know how to make this or serve this or sell that. I'll do that on my own. And somebody hires you and says, oh, gee, Jerome's really good at making widgets. Jerome, would you like to I need you to make some widgets for me. So you make some widgets. And then that guy tells somebody else, says, hey, you should buy widgets from Jerome. He's phenomenal. Now you have 2 customers. 2 becomes 20, 20 becomes 40, 40 becomes 80. Next thing you know, you hire employees, you get staff, you're dealing with the Department of Labor and all this other stuff. And then 25 years go by. And now you're running a multi-million-dollar business, and you've maybe raised a family, and all those other things that happen, right? And then you sit there and go, what's next? What now? And you need a plan, right? You talk to folks who've been down this path before, whether it's the bankers, the lawyers, the accountants, the business consultants, you name, iBankers, and work a plan that makes sense. You can get some financial outcome, all right, a harvest, if you will, from there. Or you can kind of see what happens, which is what a lot of guys do. And not to be sexist, but guys in particular are really, really bad at planning it until they have to. And it's that other category. I'll see what happens. Or they'll call a broker, a business broker one day and say, I have to sell my business. And the broker asks why. I get these calls once a month or so. And it's some combination of the 4 Ds, okay? Death, divorce, disability, or disagreement. My partner's driving me crazy. My spouse is driving me crazy. Or more likely, you're driving them crazy. I'm hurt, or someone in my family is hurt, or somebody close to me has died, and it's like, wow, I've got to wake up. Okay. Or unfortunately, in some cases, I've had talked to people who are like, yeah, my prognosis is not good. Right. So usually those are what's called triggers. All right. Often, if you will, they're unplanned exits. Sometimes there's a happy thing, right? A big company calls you and says, we love Jerome, we love the widgets you make. We need a factory where you have a factory. You've got workers, you've got vendors, you get fantastic. And then you hire somebody like me, hopefully, and we negotiate a deal. But again, that's a relatively small portion of all the business. Now, in the United States, there are many millions of businesses, but only a small portion of them are sellable businesses, transferable businesses, and only that portion in any given year will actually transfer.
You got to be the elite of the elite of the elite in order to be, and that's just to get through the transaction. You created the platinum years to help people figure out what their next is. And so having your next on the back end, I think, is the biggest indicator on whether you're going to enjoy or regret the fact that you sold your business. Can we talk a little bit about why you decided that it was important to have a plan on what you were going to do after you sell?
Well, yeah, I mean, I lived it, right? So I had been owned a business. It was actually connected to another business through a franchising process. And, we were building high-end indoor golf training centers. It was kind of like a high-end fitness club for golfers. It was kind of a cool concept back in the early 2000s. And by the mid 2000s, we had built some that were growing, this and that, but it was kind of a startup and it was still burning a lot of cash. And so I just realized in 2008 that I wasn't up for this anymore. And I was like, man, I think we've grown some value. The value of the equity that I have has really grown. Fortunately, found a third party who wanted to buy me out and buy into the parent company as well. And I was really lucky because I got my money in July of 2008. Yeah. And here's a story for you. So the buyer wanted to do it in the fall. This is back in the spring when we were negotiating. Right? And the spring of 08, everything was gangbusters, right? Economy, et cetera. And I said, I have a second home on Cape Cod where I'm calling in from today. And I don't really want to spend the summer seeing if my deal is going to go through. What's it going to, I went to my lawyer. I said, what's it going to cost me to get out? So I went back and forth and I figured out that's how much it's going to cost me. Do it. So we did it. Now, I was not prescient. Okay. My retirement funds took a hit like everybody else that fall. But I also sat on a small pile of cash. This was not millions of dollars because it was a small business. But I sat on that for a while, we all thought the world was coming to an end. But the really interesting part of that story is this. As I was sitting on the beach, I got a call from a friend who actually had stayed with the business that I had sold out of. And his name was Greg, great guy. He says, hey, he left me a voicemail. He says, Greg, she said, Paul, I am really happy for you, that you're able to get out on your terms. And I'm really sorry that, we won't be working together anymore. But I have just one question. What are you going to do next? And I looked at the phone. I said, Greg, you son of a gun, you just burst my bubble. I have no idea what I'm going to do next. Literally, I'm sitting there looking at the ocean, like, when you sit at the ocean as a sunset, by the way, if you haven't done it, and I hope most people have, really get you connected to the universe, right? And I said, I don't know what to do next, but that's a hell of a question. So I started pondering that and connecting and networking and so forth. And I ended up going to an organization here in Boston. It's now national, called the Exit Planning Exchange, XPX. It's really built not so much for me at that time, but for who I am today, which is an advisor. But they have educational sessions. And I showed up, and I've been doing a little consulting on the side, being a sales guy, and I bumped into a fellow. He goes, "Hey, Paul, what do you do?" And I had to have a line, right? Because you're networking. And I said, "Well, I help companies grow faster. I'm a sales guy. Is that something you're interested in?" And he said, "Really?" Says, he says, "Maybe." He says, "You know how people get to a point in life and they sell their business and then they go through the process and then they sit there and go, 'What's next?'" And of course, I'm biting my tongue because I should be laughing out loud, like, "Yeah, like me," right? And he says, "I have a process that fixes that." And I gave him my card and said, "We need to talk." So we had a series of talks. Those series of talks ended up in a partnership, which became the Platinum Years. And actually, if there was a parent company, but it's too complicated, another company, I should say. And we worked together for many years. He's quite a bit older than me, almost 80 now. But you know, that partnership evolved on and out. But I share this story because when you think about where I was, you know, just 7 or 8 years earlier, I was in a completely different business, totally different way. I mean, my first business was a tech startup. It's completely different. And now you think about where I am today, 24 years later, all around all of that. And I'm still answering that sort of fundamental question, helping people figure it out as I'm figuring it out. And the difference is the process that I use as I'm making sort of key decisions, which I had to learn mostly through experience. Then also when I was working with this other gentleman, we were business partners.
So you built something to scratch the itch that you had.
Yep. I mean, what we built was a combination of the experience of going through transition, plus research that I did and what my former partner had done. He did some research over in Harvard Business School. And through there, you know, we created a whole series of programs and workshops and stuff. We actually were teaching others how to do this around the world. And as I say, we had a nice run for a little while. And I still very much believe in this. I still do this, you know, on a part-time basis. I like to work with business owners. They tend to be very, very successful people because they can afford my fees. And you know, usually, you know, they leave a company with tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions. Paying me money is no big deal. But most of my time is actually working with the business owners who aren't necessarily thinking about what's next, or they think their what's next is just sell my company, Paul. And people who are advisors often joke. I share this joke, and I said, you know, I love to give referrals on my clients, but I have two problems. The first is my relationship with my clients can essentially be described as the following: short-term, intense, and terminal. It's like, I don't need a CRM because I know what the relationship will be. It's going to be 8 to 12 months and that's it, right? But the other part of it is, after a business owner has built a company 10, 20, 30 years, they have the lawyer, right? They have the accountant, right? Maybe they've worked with coaches, consultant, executives. They've got all kinds of different, you know, advisors in all the realms that touch their business. And so one day, whether it's driving down the street or one of the 4Ds hits them, right? And they go, you know, maybe I should sell this thing. Most business owners have never even met a business broker or investment banker. Like, they just don't even bump into them. They may get phone calls and letters, which they typically ignore, by the way. We'd like to sell your business. I have buyers for your business, right? I call them the liar letters, right? I have buyers for your business. Not really. At any rate, and so smart business owners, instead of just picking up the phone randomly, they call their trusted advisors, right? And say, who do you know that's good that you should introduce me to? And so that's the people who introduce me, the warm intro to someone who's a potential client. Sometimes on the coaching clients will randomly call me. They see me talk on LinkedIn or here or whatever, and then they're like, can you help me? But for selling a business, it kind of works the other way.
And so I found too that it's a referral thing, and your reputation is important, and people need to know a specific problem in order to make that referral. And I think there's another level there that most people don't talk about, and it's just how intimate and personal this conversation is. It's one thing when you're dealing with the business and it's just the numbers and it's its own entity, but me and what my purpose is, what my identity is, and the relationships that I am trying to figure out, that's a totally different level of vulnerability. Are- Do you agree with that, or is that just left
Absolutely.
field?
Yeah. I mean, people, I have to tell you, people tell me, they go through an assessment and because I have several online assessments and stuff, and they come back and they're like, no one has ever asked me these questions. I I've never really talked about this stuff with my spouse, you know, and part of my process is, helping them come to terms with they need to have these conversations. And then in some cases, coaching them through how to have these conversations. So to say, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a family therapist, I'm not a marriage counselor. I am fundamentally just a guy who's been through it, right? I've had a lot of experiences, I've absorbed some training and research, and I have a process that, it's a very standardized process. The standardized process in the coaching piece and M&A is, we refer to it as the process. It is a very structured, standardized process. There's a lot of offshoots to it. But when it comes to the personal side of like answering that what's next question, there's two parts. One is the practical part of how do I actually exit? And then the personal is like, well, what am I going to do next? And the practical is hard, don't get me wrong. I deal with that all day long in my M&A practice, right? But the personal stuff can really throw people for a loop.
Hey guys, as you might know, a very small percentage of the people who actually listen to this podcast are subscribers. So do us a favor, subscribe. In fact, we did some analytics and we found out that only 25% of the people who listen are subscribers. And our goal is to get that to about 75% over the next 3 months. So do us a favor, hit the subscribe button so you get notified when our new episodes come. We plan to bring immense value to you guys going forward as we continue to improve the content that we create at Dreamcatcher. Your dreams should be real. Let's get back to the show.
And we sometimes, in the investment banking world, so, gee, what are you going to do next? Because we're kind of supposed to ask that question as part of the process. And we usually get some iteration of, golf, gardening, grandkids. Okay, check done. He's thought about it. We're good. Let's keep going. Doesn't always work out that way. And then sometimes a deal, many deals die, right? The joke in my industry, every deal dies 3 times before it closes, right? I got an email this morning, like, oh, great, the deal is about on the 3rd death. We're going to have to resuscitate it next week. But if you get through all that, right, the deal piece, sometimes you're going to hear, or you're going to, as a business owner, you may be saying things to it. Well, I don't like this and I don't like that. And it might be about price and terms or your employment contract. But a lot of it is really about this fear, right? Or multiple fears. What am I going to do next? I'm going to fall into a black hole. I work here 6, 7 days a week, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I grew up in this business as a teenager. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that, right? My name is on the front door. I had a business owner one time, and then the person said, well, part of the reason I'm buying the business is because the name on the door. He goes, well, I'm not sure I want you to really keep the name. He goes, it's my name. I'm looked at him. You didn't mention that, 4 months ago before we went to market that the buyer is going to have to change the name of the business. I'm like, we're going to have to talk through that one. All right. Yeah. And again, it all comes down to a lot of these fears.
Wow. So, do you really believe that most people don't think about what their next is until after they're out?
Oh, I think people fantasize about it all the time. Golf, gardening, grandkids. I call them the 3 Gs, by the way, right? And so, oh, I'm going to do this, and we're going to travel. And I had a client one time, and he was absolutely convinced. I mean, he sold a business for a lot of money. He's a very, very successful guy. He goes, oh yeah, well, we're my wife and I, we're just going to travel, and we're going to do this, and we're going to spend more time with our kids. Kids are adults, no marriages or grandkids yet, and we'll do this and that. And so I said, well, that's great. Why don't you share those plans with your wife, and then we can talk about it next week. Comes back and he goes, oh, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? Well, you see, my wife stayed at home when our kids were young. And then as the kids all started moving on and going through high school and college and career, she started a career, but kind of later in life. I think she was 5 or 6 years younger than him. But let's say she was mid-50s and he was 60s. I don't really remember. And apparently she said to him, my career's just getting going. I can't just like take 3 weeks off to go to Europe or Asia. And he was just dumbfounded. And I said, yeah, I got to tell you, you got to talk through these things. You got to have a platform and a process. And it really was a conundrum, because all of a sudden the plans he had in his mind about how he would spend his time was like 52 card pickup.
He didn't have a companion.
And part of the process, he had to realize that, they would travel together, and then he would have to do other things, adventure kind of travel, where she had no interest, never going to participate in that. And therefore he would have to find other people who wanted those adventures.
For a lot of people, I think that is just overwhelming. Life being reconfigured. Do you find a pattern or a profile for people who are happiest on the backside of their exit? Because I think Wells Fargo said something along the lines of 75% of people who sell their businesses regret it.
Yeah, I've heard that similar 75%. I know a couple of organizations have done some research on that, and there's also that 75% of mergers are considered a failure 5 years post merger. And failure in the sense that they didn't achieve all of the goals of the acquirer, which often means that the acquirer's goals probably stunk and weren't well thought out and were aspirational as opposed to realistic, didn't have post-integration. But from the personal perspective, yeah, a lot of the business owners, from the research I've seen and the experience I've talked to people, they talk about regrets. Gee, my successor is doing things differently than I expected. Or the earnout that I got from this deal wasn't even close to didn't end up close to what I expected. Or, I used to walk into a room at a conference and people wanted to come up and talk to me. And now I can't get them to even look at me, or quite frankly, I'm not even allowed to go to the industry conference anymore because I'm no longer part of the industry. I was talking to somebody the other day, and it's this great expression. I'm not sure where they stole it from, but I think it's terrific. He said, I used to get 100 emails a day. And I said, 100's not bad. Some days I get worse, but regardless, 100's okay. And he said, now I will get an occasional email. He says, I don't call them emails, I call them old mail. Because basically, it's just like meaningless stuff. you know, uh, or you walk in and you expect people to like, answer your question, or whatever, and they're like, yeah, you're not the boss anymore. I don't have to answer your question. And you have no power. And that's really what it is, right? When you're the owner, right, you have the golden pen, right? The power of the pen. When that has been transferred to somebody else, which it should be, right? Because you're supposed to transfer your business. That's what's in your contract. Then you have to expect the fact that that's going to be. But most people it floors them the first time. Now there is a twist on this, and successors are very leery of this in the sense that if the employees are really loyal personally to the seller, and the seller is hanging around, that can cause tremendous friction. It wasn't my client, but another guy was telling me he sold a condition of the sale. Okay. The seller had to have an office for like a year. Now, the seller really didn't need to do too much. It wasn't particularly complicated business in the automotive industry, but the deal almost died because the buyer is like, I need that space for something else. He's like, done with the seller pay. Had to create an office for him. And of course, I'm sure it created conflict, about, the former owner is up here or some floor and, fiddling away, going to the office every day. So you get nothing else to do. Not healthy.
No, not healthy and detrimental to everybody involved because the business should be going to the next level with the new people. How important is it to have an identity outside of what you do for work, Paul?
It's enormous. Yeah, it's enormous. And so I have this identity exercise, that come out of the research and the work from the platinum years. And what I do is I ask I think it's about a dozen questions. And it starts with, and anybody can do this, but here's really what it starts with. Outside of work, and then you ask the rest of the question. Outside of work, what do I honor myself for? Outside of work, what do people say about me? Outside of work, and you just keep going through, and they're kind of variations on a theme, if you will, about helping someone recognize like who they are outside of that work role. Now, outside of work, what am I proud of? Well, if you spend most of your life working, owning and running a business, you typically are most proud of those things there. But when you say no, and people will say, well, I'm proud of that stuff. I started a business. I said, but that's work. What are you proud of outside of work? And they look at me like, oh, gee, or some have done amazing things outside of work, but they often are humble people despite their success. And all of a sudden it's like, now outside of work, why am I a good person? I one person. Outside of work, why am I a good person? He says, well, I'm not a good person. What? And we meant he says, well, I'm a sinner. She was a very religious person. So he because it was outside of work, yeah, somehow he was this sinner, right? And again, I'm not, I'm a person of faith too, but I don't really think of myself as the fact that, someone may have sinned, somehow makes them a bad person. But in their view, and then, after talking through it, he was like, oh, that's what you mean. The other good parts of my life.
And so, are you? The identity is super important. You guys have created an assessment to help people either understand that they don't have an identity outside or to have clarity on what their identity is outside. What if they get to that place and, they're 30 years in, they're thinking about selling their business and they realize they don't have an identity outside of work? What's the path to creating that?
So what I share is everybody does have an identity outside of work. They just have to spend some time thinking through it. And very often is you talk to people around you. You talk to family, you talk to friends, anybody who doesn't really value you because of the work relationship, because they don't have a work relationship with you. Right. I mean, God forbid you actually get up in the morning, go to the office all day, and then go home and don't talk to other people. You have other problems that I cannot resolve. Okay.
So it's asking those folks outside. And then I think that was something that you shared with me that was really interesting about your process. So you don't just talk to the person who's exiting, but it's almost a 360 assessment, right?
Yeah, it's really about helping I mean, for the coaching piece, the individual is what it's really geared for. I mean, I have do workshops and can run them, and I give talks, online. I talk to various colleges locally here in the Boston area. Fortunately, I was able to give a talk to Harvard Business School one time, and that was really fun. But on an individual basis, it's really time on task. Here's the homework. Here's what we're going to talk about. Go do this work. Fill out this part of the workbook. Let's talk next week. I call it the blocking and tackling and I call this personal transition planning, right? That's what the planning is all about. And it's specifically, in my case, I focus on what I call late career business owners, executives, and professionals. Basically, people 50 plus. Most of them are actually 60 plus. And part of it because I personally relate to them, but also because they don't have some of the other challenges of a person of your age or younger. They're not raising kids anymore. The kids are grown, right? They're not necessarily trying to find the love of their life because they've been married to or partners with the love of their life for decades in some cases. So some of those other things. And then also life has happened to them, right? They've often buried one or both parents. They've been to their 35th or 40th high school reunion, okay, where you see the friends and then you look at the friends who aren't there anymore, right? And so all of that process is what really emotionally drives people, at least the people who hire me to help them. Like, wow, I should be doing something about this, and maybe I need some guidance and help along the way.
So I imagine there's a good group of people out there who say, just give me my money, I'll figure it out. Do you find
I can
that to
tell you,
actually be
most of
true?
them, because they don't hire me. If everyone who went through a business transaction hired me and all the other people, that we'd have way more business than we can do. And here's it in our society, right? So first of all, let's step back a bit. Up until the middle of the 20th century, the average life expectancy globally was age 50. Globally. Now in the United States, it was somewhat over. Today, from birth and full through death in the United States, it's about 78, 78. And there are a number of countries around the world which is into the 80s. As I said, it's people who eat a lot more fish than we do, right? Just think of Japan and other countries where people live much longer. But retirement was essentially aspirational, right? And so the real estate industry was starting to build retirement communities, right? Sun City and this and that. And they were having a problem selling them because people didn't understand what a retirement community was. They knew what a retirement home was. That's where you would go when you were no longer physically healthy. And then it became nursing homes, so forth. So, the term the golden years, here's a fun fact for you and your audience. That was an invented term. And it was invented by the real estate industry in order to sell retirement communities. That's the truth. Yep. And I forget the gentleman who got it. I'm blanking out at the moment. I've got it in my notes somewhere. He made so much money selling retirement communities, basically, sand and I mean, as they say, swamps in Florida and sand in Arizona. He made so much money doing that. He stopped defending the trademark. He just gave it up. And so that's where the golden years became, part of the lexicon. So the rest of us, okay, aspire to the golden years, and it's the rocking chairs, it's golf, gardening, grandkids, right? The 3Gs, et cetera, shuffleboard, all the jokes, whatever. But then as the baby boomers came of age and got into this age bracket, all of a sudden it's like, gee, I don't know, shuffleboard, I don't know about that. Do I really want to be shunted off to some little place down in the swamp or the desert? Maybe I want something else. And that's where, quite frankly, the need for folks like me and many others who do this work, it's like, oh, but a lot of other people think of retirement as a financial process, right? If you save enough money for retirement, it's like there's some people in the financial services industry, you have to know your numbers. If you hit a certain number, then you've got all the money you need, finish it financially independent, now you can retire, right? And that's all great, but you actually have to live. You have to be actually alive. How do you have a conscious life? And the work that you do, me and others who talk about this, is we give people an opportunity, often for the first time in their life, of consciously designing their future. And if for people who want to do that and are willing to do that, and more frankly, who are willing to pay for the help, and that is a whole other conundrum, it is an absolutely transformational process for them.
So why wouldn't somebody make the investment? Because it seems like a no-brainer. They're going into a new space. They're going into a new place. They don't really have the experience. They're scared. It seems like support is a no-brainer.
Yeah, a part is lack of knowledge, and part of it is, what do you mean I have to plan? I've been planning my whole life, and I don't want to plan. I just want to relax. And people, the default, okay, is, well, other friends of mine, other family, they just retired. They didn't do any planning. They're fine. Well, how do you know they're fine? Well, they tell me they're fine. Great. Now, here's some terrible statistics, right? I mean, in this talk I've given a talk many, many times called The Retirement Journey, Discover What's Next, right? So the rate of divorce for people in their age 50 plus has like tripled, right, from where it was in 1990, right? The amount of substance abuse for older people has exploded, all right? The level of suicide for older people has exploded, particularly men, all right? And a lot of that, all right, all of these various forms of, if you will, mental illness, a lot of that is driven by people who are unmoored, people who, quote unquote, lost their way, they've lost their purpose in life. I mean, the Wall Street Journal has had a great article about this recently. His husband and wife were arguing and this and that, and he'd retired. And what she was not realizing, because she was still working, is that he had actually fallen into a depression. All right. And he was exhibiting, aggressive behavior and this and that, not just laying in bed, not doing it, but, he was kind of like, I call it outwardly depressed, which is an odd term. Right. That's some psychologists would probably reprimand me for it because I'm not a psychologist. That's it. They have these behaviors, and ultimately it's like, oh, right. So why people don't do it is some combination of, my friends, they don't need to, so I don't need to. I'm okay. I can do it myself. And sometimes, they don't know, they don't necessarily appreciate the value of it. In some cases, they can't afford it, So anyway. there's lots of reasons people don't do things. Because the default is like, well, I'll figure it out. And to be honest, most people can't figure it out, but it will take them a couple of years. That's what most people I know say. Yeah, it took me a while. It took me a couple of years to kind of figure out a routine and this and that. And then they can end up in a decent place, or at least at least from the outside it appears to be.
The figure it out thing scares me because of the collateral damage that is created during that time of figuring it out. You talk about the divorces, you talked about a bunch of other negative things that, from my perspective, usually just destroys a person's legacy in pretty short order.
It can. Yeah, I mean, it is unfortunate. But I always, having talked about this since 2009, 2010, to all kinds of audiences here and up now, we can talk to people around the world online easily. And the commonalities are that you see the same kind of reaction from people and the resistance to it. It's this odd curiosity of like, this is something that everyone should do if they've given themselves permission to do it. All right. And they're willing to take the time and learn how to do it. But, there's lots of people who say they'd like to learn to play the guitar. And I can't tell you the number of clients, whether in workshops, and oh yeah, I want to learn the guitar. And they get to the process, yeah, I'm never going to do that. Okay, that's fine.
So for the people that do get the help, can you see a meaningful difference in the outcome, or do you think everybody gets to the same place?
Well, I can't give you a scientific answer because I only know the audience who hires me. And so the people who hire me, they tell me, and from my experience speaking with them, and I try to stay in contact with some of them, and they're open to it, that they follow the process. They really have made these decisions that they end up in a much better place because they feel they planned it, right? They didn't let life come at them. They chose to consciously design a life. In terms of the rest of the people who don't necessarily use the process, the only thing I can default to is the statistics, which I continually read about, because many older folks haven't planned well. Some haven't planned financially, but many people, even if planned financially, haven't planned, that emotional, psychological process, social process. And so then all these other bad behaviors come to fore, which, by the way, bad behaviors can significantly impact, financial difficulties. And if you've got underlying issues in your life that you're not resolving, money will never solve them. So like just a financial advisor gave him this great quote. He says, let me tell you, this guy's been in it like 30 years. He says, people have this false impression that money solves problems. He says, money amplifies problems. Wow, what a great comment.
Every single time. And it breaks my heart when you amplify a problem in a space where people have more time to even think about the problem, because that pressure usually breaks them and creates a situation where they spiral and create a ton of collateral damage.
I mean, the upside is for not an enormous amount of time. And I typically work with clients once a week for 3 months. At the end of that process, they've got a written plan that they've really created. I guide them through the process just by asking them a ton of questions, and then they take that and work with it. I'm sure you've got something similar, and the workshops I've run the same way. Like my job today is just to poke a lot of questions at you. You've got to go do the work. But, if you're going to do probably 20 or 30 hours of work spread out over several months, that's really not a big lift. But it feels like a big lift at the beginning because you don't know what you're in for, right? And sometimes it's, not like the answers that you come up with, because it's sort of like, I have this aspiration, this is fantastic, life is amazing, I sold my business, as the case might be, I'm going to retire. And then the hard stuff comes at you. But if you do that planning, then and you process it now, as opposed to, floating on down the line and having it hit you in the head, I think people are better off.
Well, this is good. I could talk to you for hours with all of the knowledge and wisdom you've developed over the decades that you've been in the industry, man. You've seen a lot of people go through the process. If you had to pick one thing that was going to be an indicator for them enjoying the process and life after their exit, what would you say it is?
I would say when somebody has that sort of moment that they recognize the fear that is the underlying fear, right? Sometimes it could be, they're driven individuals. Most of my clients are very driven individuals. That's why they're highly successful. But some of that underlying fear is, fear of failure, which is really fear of success in reverse, right? It could be fear of, or, living up to a very successful parent in some cases. And when someone has that moment that really grabs them, right? Because I have someone go through a whole what are they afraid of process. Then, and that sort of liberates them. Here's how I can manage that fear. I don't use the word overcome, but here's how I can manage that fear by asking myself a series of questions. When I have what I think is a choice, right? Binary choice, they stop and they say, oh, I mean, there are some choices in the middle that I can discover if I'm willing to open my mind up to those other choices. Most choices are rarely a binary choice. That was what I think is, that's what I call, that's when the switch goes off. And they can really say, wow, this is going to be a powerful process. When they get to at the end, they're like, most of the people give me some iteration of the phone. When I think, because I ask them, when you think back and you write your goals or what you want to accomplish and where you are now, like, how do you feel about that? And most people will tell me some iteration. They all tell me, I should say, the iteration of the following. When I think about where I was, where I am today, and I think about friends of mine who thought they could do this on their own and where they are today, man, am I in a much better place. There you go.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. Paul, you're a dream catcher yourself and you're helping other people catch their dreams, man. So thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jerome. It's been fantastic.
All right. To the listeners, your dreams should be real. We'll catch you on the next episode.